Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. Over the past 5 years, the historic role of philanthropy in upholding colonial structures and injustices has raised important questions about how philanthropic organizations can evolve to be a force of good for the future. With the recent changes to the disbursement quota and the regulations around funding non-qualified donees, and the rise in community-centered fundraising, and the revelations around the chronic lack of funding to Indigenous, Black, and women's organizations and causes, it's clear that many feel that philanthropy, as we've known it, is ready for a shakeup. Joining us to discuss these important issues is Andrew Chunilall, the CEO of Community Foundations of Canada. Andrew joined the CFC in 2013 and became CEO in 2017, following a 6-year tenure as Vice President of Finance for the London Community Foundation and his long service as a finance and regulatory expert for Canada's philanthropic sector. Now at the head of the Community Foundation movement, Andrew is working with the CFC leadership team, boards, and foundations in Canada and abroad to help the philanthropic sector transform, innovate, and meet the new challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thank you, Mary, and I appreciate the invitation to be here. And you set the conversation up just really nicely. Thank you very much.
Well, I would love it if you could start off by telling us about your organization, who you represent, and the work those foundations do in Canada.
Absolutely. So I'm with Community Foundations of Canada. We are an organization that is about 30 years old, and we represent a network of local place-based philanthropic institutions that we call community foundations. And as you mentioned, when I joined Community Foundations of Canada in 2013, there were 191 community foundations in Canada at that time. There's now 205. But when Community Foundations of Canada emerged as its own institution almost 30 years ago, we were created by the membership. And at that time, there were just a little over 20 community foundations. And at that time, we were given the mandate to create more community foundations. And so we saw proliferation of philanthropic institutions across Canada. So in a very short period of time, when you think about it, only 30 years, we went from about 20 community foundations to over 200. Which is a 10 times growth in these locally based institutions. And it demonstrates the power of community and what can happen when people come together to work on challenges in their community, and the importance of institution in that context. Community Foundations of Canada, as I mentioned, our original mandate was to create more community foundations and create a network. And when I joined in 2013, we sort of had a taking stock period of, do we really want to create more community foundations? Is that a primary goal? Or do we want to think about how we can work together better? Because as I mentioned, we're local, we're place-based, and we never thought about what we could do collectively as a network. And in more recent years, we've been doing a lot of work together and working in partnership and having an impact across Canada. So that's a little bit about community foundations.
Is the idea about having more community foundations related to the sense that people who are closest to the communities that they are mandated to help, or organizations that are more place-based, as you say, are more effective?
Yeah, absolutely. The very first community foundation in Canada is the Winnipeg Foundation. And in fact, the province that has the most community foundations is Manitoba. And it's all about place. Place seems to be a primary connection point for belonging and community. And people feel connected through the place that they live. And that's a formation point for philanthropy. And I can get into this a little bit later in our conversation. It's also become the impediment. And so this paradox happens a lot in our lives. The things that give us strength and bring assets at some point begin to have diminishing returns and then become impediments to future innovation. But absolutely, locality and place is the center of belonging in this country. But we're also challenging those paradigms as well.
I wonder if you could explain what the difference is for those of us who might not be having I guess, the nuanced understanding about foundations, what the difference is between private foundations and public foundations, and what are community foundations in that space?
Absolutely. Maybe it's best to just start with the legal differentiation, but that's just the beginning point. The boards of public foundations operate at arm's length, meaning that the people on those boards, as an example, aren't related by blood. Whereas in private foundations, those boards are not at arm's length. And so it sort of starts there, but the differences move on. So private foundations typically receive their wealth in one or a few transactions from the person that created the wealth and created the foundation. And so they're typically not fundraising organizations. Whereas public foundations, which are community foundations, they are actively in the space of building more financial capital. And you will see that a community foundation, as an example, will grow in asset size over time because of that. And then community foundations or public foundations typically have a higher degree of transparency and engagement with the public. And that's not to say that doesn't happen in private philanthropy, but it's not their modus operandi. So those are some of the key distinctions between the two.
And are foundations and philanthropists doing enough to support the nonprofit sector, especially when it's facing such challenging times since the COVID-19 pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I've never seen Canadians be more generous than they were during the pandemic, and we saw a lot of growth in giving and openness to giving in new ways. My sense is that it's never enough. The problems and challenges that we're dealing with in society today are fairly complex, and certainly the level of need and support that was required through the pandemic went up exponentially. For me, it's not so much about whether foundations and donors are doing enough; it's whether we're doing the right thing. And I think that's the question we've got in front of ourselves, which is, are we making an effort to tackle the challenges in our community at the root cause level or at the systems level? And I think that's an area that has a tension point for us. As I mentioned, we've got a long history, and our history really is around working with and supporting charities in our communities, and that's a noble thing to do, and we should certainly keep that front and center. But is it getting us closer to solving the challenges that create the needs in the first place? And I don't think it is. And so we're trying to consider who we are in the ecosystem of nonprofits, charities, philanthropy, and donors. What role do we want to play? Do we want to step back and then go to the root cause and bring people together, philanthropists, government, the private sector, grassroots organizations? Do we want to bring people together, use our convening power to tackle some of these challenges where they begin, which ultimately will be beneficial to charities and nonprofits that work in our communities? But it takes a lot of time, and it's very complex. So I think it's not so much about quantum; it's about effectiveness of the tools that we're deploying.
Well, in recent years, there have been many calls to make changes to foundation giving, including increasing the disbursement quota, creating more avenues to fund non-qualified donees or those who don't have, charitable status, and a move towards what is known as trust-based giving. Where do you think we're at with these changes, and has the sector gone far enough?
Yeah, we've certainly, had a lot of conversation around this in the last few years. Definitely sparked by the pandemic, but they were in the water system before, and that is, are we doing enough as foundations? The disbursement quota conversation was at the center of that, and I've been working in the nonprofit sector for a little over 20 years, and I've never seen a more polarizing conversation than both the disbursement quota conversation and then the changes to the non-qualified donee status. And it was a conversation that was long overdue. Now, here's the thing: the disbursement quota was 3.5%, and the new legislation has brought it up to 5%. When we looked at the data as an example for community foundations, typically, and there's 205 community foundations, so there's some variability here, but typically community foundations were already granting at 5% and above in many cases, because our granting is not a function of the legislative requirement. Our granting is a function of investment returns. So the higher the investment returns that we can achieve, typically you will see a higher granting level. And the opposite is true. So our granting is a function of market returns, which is a good thing because we've been granting at higher levels in the disbursement quota. And at the same time, it has the other side of the coin is that our business models are attached to growth, to capital growth in the stock market. And we've not been paying enough attention to how we're earning that growth. We certainly don't have poor intentions. We do the thing that the capital markets want us to do, which is to be prudent investors and to invest with an aim to generate a return on investment. And then we use that return to do positive, constructive work in our communities. However, we don't really know if, as investors, whether those investments are helping the work that we're doing in community or detracting from it. And that's still an open question. And, obviously we've talked a lot about ESG and impact investing over the years. And I think that's where our business model needs to sort of recalibrate. We need to build new tools to understand our investments. Are they fostering the same type of impact that we're having with the granting side of our work, or are they making it more difficult? And that's an unknown thing. Now, many people, the critics would say, no, that's known. You're invested in the energy sector. You're invested in extractive industries. You're invested in companies that take advantage of cheap labor in global markets. And some of that is true. So I think in that regard, we need to understand our business model, its relationship to capitalism, and its relationship to what's impeding our communities, and then try to align such that we're fully mission aligned.
Oh, that's very interesting. So what you're talking about is some of the criticisms do have some credibility, and that there's, if I understand you correctly, there has to be more thought about, I guess, doing the kind of more kind of morals-based kind of investing, where you're aligning your philanthropic intentions with the type of investments that you do to raise funds that you then disperse. Am I understanding you correctly? I may not be describing it using the proper terminology, but is that generally what you're talking about?
Yeah, I wouldn't use the term moral because I think that can be that can be up for interpretation. But I will say that it should be mission aligned. So let me give you a very simple example. Let's suppose we were in a community where childhood obesity was an issue, and that was our mission to work on that particular issue and to try and resolve it in our community. And then we're granting, we're building relationships in the community. We're putting resources behind awareness around education and so forth. And then our investment portfolio, which is sort of off to the side here, which has 90% of our assets in it, sometimes more. We're invested in Coca-Cola and Pepsi and industries where there's lots of sugar in their products. And you can see how those two things, in a very simple example, how those two things work against each other. And so, like, the emission alignment is like, actually, hey, is there something happening in the companies that we're investing in that could somehow detract from what's playing out in our community?
Where are you on this journey of realigning your investment to have it more mission aligned with where you invest in order to raise the funds that you disperse at the foundation at the community level? How has this gone over with the community foundations generally?
This is a contentious issue, Mary, and I wouldn't present it as we're all in the same place. I think there are some community foundations that have who have been taken steps to really think about their investment portfolio and how they can orient it around impact, or how they can at least understand how that portfolio impacts their mission. And I think there's also like a very strong argument out there that I wouldn't criticize the argument. I just would say that it's a different ideology, which is that hey, we're investing for purpose, and that purpose is to create more capital for our communities, because our communities need more capital to do good work. And that's a legitimate argument. We can't take anything away from that. And in fact, that's the way when we've been doing business for a long, long time. And so I don't feel as though there needs to be a right or wrong answer on this. I just do want to recognize is that there is some polarity around this in our business model, and that we will probably, as a network, operate with both, recognizing that there are advantages and disadvantages to both, but that really this is left up to community. Communities need to decide what's most important for them, and then they can enact that through these institutions that they call community foundations, and go from there. My personal point of view is that we do need to align both our granting and our investments around our mission, and we need the data to inform whether we're doing that effectively. And I think that's the other thing. We don't necessarily have the data. When we make investment choices, like when you and I invest in our TFSAs or our RSPs or in our whatever accounts that we have, oftentimes when we look at our investments, we're consulting with our advisors, or we're making those choices on our own. And we're looking at the profitability of those institutions, because we want our investment return. We don't necessarily get into all the other things, whether are these institutions, do they have women in leadership? Do they have people in color in leadership? Do they engage their communities in helping to build the communities in which they operate and sell their products? Those seem to be secondary issues. But I think they're rising to the top. I think there's a generation of Canadians that are prioritizing those aspects of investments, and we'll see that permeate in institutions of philanthropy as well.
There have been some recent reports about the chronic lack of funding to Black, Indigenous, and feminist charities and causes. What do you think needs to change in the philanthropic community to ensure that funding is more equitable and is truly addressing the inequalities that exist in Canada?
Yeah, and that's that's an issue that's front and center for all of philanthropy. Philanthropy has been criticized for being too male and too white, and many would say that it's those types of demographic makeups that then inform who we engage with, how we engage with them, or if we engage with them. And I think there's some truth to that, but I also think it's overly reductive. I think that we have some cultural challenges, which is that philanthropy comes from wealth, and wealth comes from powerful people, and there's a power dynamic in that, and oftentimes to work with communities that we don't have relationships with, or that we don't understand, or that we treat as somehow low capacity or less than, has always been a challenge for us. And so, we've been trying to build relationships with those communities by inviting those communities to be a part of our ecosystem and our culture, both to have the relationship and trust, but to inform each other and one another on how we can be collaborative, and how we can build resilient communities together. And so I think that's the real challenge. It's at the relational level, but that's shifting. I think we're making a lot of changes. We've seen the proliferation of Black-led and Black serving, Indigenous-led, Indigenous serving, women-led, women serving organizations across this country. And I've seen philanthropic institutions really get behind supporting those organizations. So I think we're in a period of transition, but it shouldn't, and I don't want to just point out the transition without acknowledging that there has been bias, and there has been systemic racism in philanthropy. Like, those things exist. But I think we're a lot further along in this journey than we have been in a long time.
So you mentioned that there are these systemic kind of issues. Are there systemic barriers? Could you identify what they might be that exist when it comes to the more equitable distribution of philanthropic funds? Do you feel that the legislative changes, such as the disbursement quota, are steps towards correcting this?
I don't think the disbursement quota solves for this. I think the disbursement quota increases the floor and on what's required to be dispersed, but it doesn't deal with the allocation issue, which is where I think your question is. And that was something that was debated, which is, we want to increase the disbursement quota. Sure, that can be a good thing. But is it going to serve underserved communities? And, when we looked out at the landscape and some of the work that we were doing, we understood that not a lot of philanthropic dollars were making it out to the Canadian North and isolated communities. Not a lot of philanthropic dollars were making it out to Black communities. And the unfunded report provided some data to support that. We also understood that not a lot of philanthropic dollars were making it to Indigenous communities. Now, we could take it a step further and say, well, in those communities, there's not very many charities. And so we have this legislative requirement that we have to grant to qualified donees. And so that was a barrier, a legal barrier. But I think it was more perception as a barrier. We have a permissive enough, flexible enough regulatory regime that we can find ways to work with different organizations in different parts of the country, whether there's a charity there or not. However, the legislative change does make it easier, and we're working that through. I think the real barrier is that philanthropy has not developed the relationships that it needs to effectively work in those communities. And many people will say this: you just don't show up in a community, or you don't just show up with a constituency and say, "Here's what we're doing." We need to be educated. We need to build those relationships. We need to understand. There needs to be a relationship, and that takes time, and it takes intentional effort. But it also requires us to build relationships with people and communities that we may, in a first instance, not think we have much in common with. And so that actually is the barrier. And oftentimes when we think we are working in communities like the Indigenous community, the Black community, we are often fearful of working in places where we feel like we could make mistakes, and we could be called out for them. in an unhealthy way. And again, that just goes to trust and relationships. So again, I think we're working through some of these challenges. Many community foundations and private philanthropy are working very closely with the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, as an example, or the Foundation for Black Communities. And so we're really pulling those old impediments away, and we're establishing a base of trust through which will help us, move resources and empower those communities.
What are your thoughts on the growing income and wealth divide in Canada and how that impacts the public perception of philanthropy? Are you seeing both private and public funders facing greater scrutiny today?
Yeah. So the criticism, to be precise, is that the community foundation model, as an example, requires some degree of wealth inequality. People are giving us their excess wealth, and so we have an attachment to the system being the way that it is, and then we use that excess wealth to create more wealth in the capital markets. Thomas Piketty, he's a French economist, and he's written a lot about capitalism and inequality. And he is able to support the following, is that in any economy, capital-based economy, those with capital experience higher growth of wealth than those without capital. And so capital grows faster than a country's growth, i.e. GDP. And so philanthropic institutions, we hold capital. That's the primary asset on our balance sheet. So we're always going to experience growth at a faster rate. Plus, we bring in new forms of capital every year. And so when you have that much capital, it provides a platform, it provides positionality, it provides influence. It's a big responsibility, and those that are without it really need us to understand what's going on in the community. And then we have to deploy that capital in an effective way. And I think that's the thing that we're grappling with. It's at a systems level, which is to say, do we rely too heavily on wealth inequality and capitalism for our own growth at the detriment of community? And that's the criticism. However, there are things that we're doing to address that criticism, which is to, in the two organizations that I mentioned earlier, the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund and the Foundation for Black Communities, philanthropy across Canada has brought their own capital and their own resources to those organizations to help seed and fund and help their own capacity building. So there's this notion of sharing the capital. We don't talk about that much, but we are sharing capital now because we know it's empowering, and we know it's powerful. So that's one way to counteract some of those criticisms. The other thing to do is to deal with the issue of proximity. And I remember when I first began my career at a community foundation, the board. It was an amazing thing. I remember showing up at a board meeting. I was the VP Finance, and all the people where I live in London, Ontario, who had buildings named after them or wings at the hospital, they were on that board. It was the elite of London, Ontario. But these particular individuals who are extremely generous, smart, great community builders didn't quite have the proximity to some of the challenges we were facing, whether it's poverty or inequality or discrimination or being a newcomer. Like, they just didn't have the level of proximity. So I also think at a governance and a leadership level, we have to bring people with lived experience into those roles. And that is another part of how we can deploy capital better, is that let's get the decision makers who really understand and know where the deficiencies are in our communities, where the shortcomings are, and where resources need to go and how they need to be deployed there. Let's bring them to the table. And I think a lot of these interventions are happening. They've been happening in the last 3 to 5 years to counteract some of that criticism that you talked about before.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. I'm particularly intrigued by this idea of sharing the capital with the organizations that you've mentioned. I wonder, when we take a look at some of the criticisms, I guess we've heard um, in media, but also within the sector. Um, are the disbursement quota increases and your report that talks about most community foundations are really getting more than 5% returns on their investments, but they're also giving more than the quotas. Is this enough to stop the accusations that foundations are, in quotation marks, hoarding wealth instead of using it to solve today's most pressing issues? What are your thoughts on that?
It won't be enough. Like the only thing that really can be done to deal with that narrative out there that we're hoarding wealth is that we'd have to undergo a fundamental transformational change in the business model. Because, like I mentioned earlier on, we accumulate more wealth every year. Sometimes you might see a dip if markets go down, but so you have to sort of look at this at a systemic level, which is we operate in a system, an economic system called capitalism. It has a job to do. The system has a job to do, which is to produce capital, and it does. And then, but the system's not intelligent enough to deal with redistribution or how capital gets allocated. Human beings do that. We do that through government. We have a system of taxation. We do that through philanthropy. We're redistributing that wealth, and so the optics of that is, hey, if your wealth goes up every year because capitalism is working, and people are creating more wealth, and our communities continue to suffer, there's this big gap that as institutions you're getting stronger, but the communities in which you serve aren't necessarily getting stronger. And I think that's a very reductive argument. However, it's a perception that is creating a narrative that is very much out there. Now, even though it's reductive, there are things that we can do to do better. And one of the things that the sector has done is we've tied our own hands. Like I said earlier on, we have some of the most permissible regulatory legislation in this country. Anybody can set up a charity. There are not many countries in the world where you can just file a paper application, mail it in, and in 6 to 9 months, you're a registered charity. And we can do that in Canada. But we've also created things that are an impediment to us. And this is where I started off earlier in our conversation. Philanthropy has things like we call them restricted funding. So we actually restrict, or we work in a place where donors restrict to us what can happen with the money, and then we also restrict on the granting side. So you create a set of restrictions that become an impediment from deploying capital effectively, using data, using lived experience, and using input from the community. Because now you've got to negotiate these restrictions. The other things that we've done is we've created things called donor advised funds. The Canada Revenue Agency did not create donor advised funds, nor did they create restrictions. We created those things. Our articles of incorporation, our charitable objects, those are things that we have written up. And so oftentimes we restrict on our geography. We restrict in which the communities we operate. We restrict on how much money we can disperse. We restrict on whether we can even use the capital or not by saying, hey, it has to be held in perpetuity. And so these are things that we can undo. They're completely made up. They're there to serve a purpose. I'm not sure what that purpose is. Maybe it's about prioritizing the donor. I don't know, but we have these things. And we need to look at why we have these things and whether they're serving us today in 2023. And if they're not, we should unwind them, or we should create new tools and new structures within our model that will serve the community in a better way. And I think that will help to deal with the fact that we are going to continue to assemble wealth and capital in a variety of different ways.
So is this sense of unwinding some of these restrictions something that you can do collectively, or is it sounds like it's something that each individual foundation would have to challenge themselves on?
Yeah, absolutely. And like, here's the thing. I do represent the Community Foundation Network, and there, as I mentioned, over 200 community foundations. Now, the points of view that I'm expressing may not, I may not have agreement from the entire network on those points of view. And it isn't to say that the alternatives aren't legitimate arguments. But what I am doing is I'm responding to the criticisms that are out there, and I'm offering up things that we can do, intervention points that we can make within our business model to help deal with that criticism. So, in respect to your question, I think that these things are happening and changing with certain institutions, but it's not uniform. But as a movement, as a network, I think we are moving forward. I think everybody is trying to do more and to address the criticism in their own way. I don't see stasis at all. However, the question is that you can never do enough quick enough. And so, I just wanted to make that point.
Can you perhaps provide an update on some of your big initiatives, including the Canadian Philanthropic Committee on Climate Change or your work with Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're engaged in a lot of work. Probably the biggest thing that's going on for us right now is we're working in partnership with the Canadian Red Cross and United Way Canada to deliver the Community Services Recovery Fund. And this is a joint initiative between ourselves and those other two organizations I mentioned to deploy $400 million from the federal government through our institutions to our community foundations to help with a lot of the pain points that have come up because of the pandemic. And that's about building capacity. It's about delivering services. It's about thinking about how we can deliver more inclusive programming. It's about innovation. And that's happening right now, where that money is going to be going out in the next 60 to 90 days. You mentioned the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund. They were housed within Community Foundations of Canada for a period of time, but now they have their registered charity status, and so they're their own standalone organization. And they're innovating. They're actually thinking about, we talked about a lot about investments in this conversation, Mary, but they're thinking about investments through an Indigenous lens, which has a vastly different context. And, some of the philosophies that I've heard them talking about is that, hey, the capital is really important, but it doesn't serve much purpose if it's just sitting on your balance sheet. And how do we actually get capital into community? Because that's a way of re-energizing capital and replenishing capital. But they think about capital in a very holistic way. Relational capital, intellectual capital, convening capital, social capital. But they use financial capital to build all those other things. And so we're learning from them. We're learning from these other institutions. We have many other things that we're doing in terms of Alliance 2030, which is our hosting of the Sustainable Development Goals Unit in collaboration with the federal government. And so 2030 is coming up fast, and there's big lofty goals, 17 large goals there that have been identified. And so we work with community foundations across the country to track our communities' progress towards those goals. But collectively, there's a dozen things that community foundations work together on, in addition to what they just do locally on their own. As I mentioned earlier on, we used to work independently and we would collaborate in terms of sharing ideas and approaches. But our collaboration is much more sophisticated now. There's about 2,000 community foundations or place-based philanthropic institutions across the world. We are probably the only country in the world where community foundations actually work together on big Canadian issues, and that's a unique aspect of our network.
Yeah, that's really impressive. I wonder if you could just sort of do a bit of a deeper dive for our audience of how significant that difference is for Canadian foundations.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I'll go to the Community Services Recovery Fund. It's a big deal. It's $400 million. So if you're the federal government and you know that communities are suffering, and that key funding interventions are required to help deliver services, to help keep institutions propped up during this very difficult time. It's very difficult as a government to deploy those resources with a high degree of precision. And what I mean by that is, how do you identify the institutions and the organizations that are the most needy? How do you deploy those resources in a way that is culturally aligned? How do you respect the politics of the locality? And in a country that is as significant as Canada in terms of size, but also in terms of regional differences, the government could never do that on their own. And so what's been fundamental, both with the United Way, the Canadian Red Cross, and with community foundations, is we have that capacity because we're in community. We're governed by the community. We're led by the community and informed by the community. And so when the government has a partner like us, it helps to optimize the funding flows. And so that money gets to exactly where it needs to be. And it's not politicized because the community is self-determining what's important. Now, the community's got challenges too, in that there's a vast amount of need and a finite amount of resources. But that's always going to be the case. The point being is that we are deploying these resources in the most optimal way that we can. And that makes us a really attractive partner at a national scale or a regional scale.
And finally, really, as a leader of a national organization representing foundations, I certainly hear in our conversation that you feel that philanthropy, as we're currently thinking of it, needs to be and is in the process of being reimagined. Is that really, am I reading you correctly?
Yes, and we're at the early stages of this, Mary. I think reimagining. We use the term transformation, and a lot of people will ask me, "What does that really mean, Andrew?" And it's not about changing laws or policies or even retooling in a first instance. Transformation really is about changing the way that we think. And I think that is work that can't be done overnight. It's slow by nature. Like we've spent 1,000 years getting here, and we've realized, hey, we're not doing right by climate. We're not doing right by equity seeking groups. Like we understand that. But the true change will come from our alternative ways of thinking. And then that in turn will then help us to create new tools, which will then help us to have different types of institutions, leadership and governance. But the pace of change is slow.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much. Your insight and perspectives on the philanthropic community and the nuances too, and the key issues impacting philanthropy in Canada is greatly appreciated and important for our audience to understand and for me to understand. Thank you for joining us at CharityVillage Connects.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to speaking again.